John and I met, John Dyer and I met, first time I think in, actually it's probably 3 years ago now in Seattle, at the Seattle Pacific, at a faith and tech conference that Al Erzman, who some of you may remember that name, he was putting, he spoke at graduation here. He's the senior VP of engineering from Boeing that's now retired and teaches at the Faith and Ethics or Business and Ethics Center at Seattle Pacific. Had a great conference, a lot of folks there talking about how does our faith inform specifically our technology, or we call it the theology of technology and so forth. And John has been written one of the, what I think will become the early works in the historical perspective, called From the Garden to the City, and he's written a great work there. It's a great read and great, very biblically based, sound looking at how we speak to this. Technology can be redemptive and technology can be corruptive. And so he just spoke in chapel, did a great job in chapel. We appreciate having him here. He spoke at our Faith and Work Summit in Boston as well a couple weeks ago. And then his wife Amber actually worked here 10 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that, a while ago. And so she was a student here. She worked in admissions, and now she's an adjunct professor teaching for us. So there's a maternal connection there with Amber. He has 2 great kids, and they love the technology and the parenting that he gets to do, and so forth in there. He's now the Executive Director of Communication and Educational Technology at DTS. So a lot of the things that we do here, DTS is based with, and in fact there are 2 Lukes. Where'd they go? Oh, there they are. Luke and Luke. In fact, in the chapel we had Matthew, we had Mark Jonah. Where's Mark? And then Luke and John. If there's any Acts and Romans, we can do that. But anyway, glad to have the DTS folks here as well. Very appreciative of your time here as well. So anyway, I'm going to turn this over to John, just give the time to him and let him dialogue and use this time. We're very glad to have him here. So thank you, John.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. So yeah, my wife has really fond memories of being here at Laterno. I know some of you were here when she was here. That's been a lot of fun. I wish she could have come, but that let me give her a hard time at chapel at that one point. So I'm curious from you all, since you've had, I looked at the speaker lineup and I thought, man, half those people were like my heroes. So I want to know, what were some of the best sort of takeaway things for you, and then what things do you hope your students have gotten out of a whole semester of focusing on technology? And what things maybe are missing? Those are kind of things I was thinking of. I've gotten to go to a couple different Christian colleges, and I'm thinking, what are they getting, and what are the things that they're still missing when they go through? So anybody had a favorite speaker or a favorite topic? I'll tweet Andy and tell him you guys thought it was terrible. Just kidding. Yeah.
I think something that I would really want students to understand, and I'm still trying to learn about, is just how formative the practices we engage are. And so habits are formative, and they form us, and so not that your cell phone or anything is bad, but it does change you. And I think that there's this, it's neutral.
Yeah.
Sense is what a lot of students think.
So, okay, you evaluated. You heard me. Did you get that, like, technology is just neutral from me, or did you hear pivot, or what did you hear?
I'm going to be really honest, I was at a meeting.
Oh, that's all right.
No.
No.
Go to the chapel, so.
No, I was just curious if that becomes clear in the examples I give, or if you're like, yeah, it still felt like it wasn't quite there.
I think you were really clear.
Okay. Well, good. Now, if you've had a whole semester of things, what are some other things that you were like, man, I hope the students took away from the various speakers? Or things you hope they didn't take away, and there was a speaker that was.
Yeah, Doreen Dongan, when she was here, was talking about what technology, what computer and cell phone technology does to our brain. And that really kind of
Yeah. Would you characterize most of her observations as negative?
no, she said she loved technology.
Okay.
But we should have strongly warned to have at least a Sabbath from technology every so often.
Yeah. Now, So I showed a picture at the beginning of the chapel where my family and I got to spend most of the summer, about 4 months, living over in Durham, England, just to start PhD work for me. And what was really fascinating about it was that we rented this little flat, which was built like in the 1800s for an old mining town in Durham. And so it was like a 12 by 12 living room that they had added on plumbing on the back with a bathroom and a kitchen, and they added bedrooms on top, which were literally just bedrooms. Like there's a room maybe like a foot or two around the clearance. So that was a pretty big difference because our house in Dallas is will average like 3-bedroom kind of starter home sort of thing that we'll stay in forever. But it was a big move because it was from like 2,000 up to 650 square feet, and there's no microwave, there's no dishwasher, there's no dryer for the clothing at a place that always looks like this, except it's like at 40 degrees and always rain. And we didn't have a car, and so it was interesting to me because it was like we took a 4-month Sabbath from all the technology before we were born. So it's interesting to me that we feel the need to Sabbath from the stuff invented after we were born, but none of us Sabbath from air conditioning. None of us Sabbath from refrigeration or from lighting. And yet, if you look at the Book of Common Prayer in the 1800s, it has all these prayers about God, get us through the night. It's so scary. Please be with us. We're praying. And then once lighting was invented, they took all those out. And there are no fearful through the nights letting out, right? So it made me think about what we Sabbath from. Not to say that it's that they're all the same thing, but to think, okay, if we feel the need to Sabbath from it, what does that tell us about the thing? And then why have we not Sabbath from other things? Like no one talked about when we were all kids taking a Sabbath from a phone. We're gonna have a phone every day. We just didn't do that. Why did we not do that? Or driving or something like that. So I think it brings up a lot of questions. And I think my favorite thing about thinking about the technology stuff is that I think it helps you constantly reflect on what does it mean to be human? How do I do that well in this area? Because I can't go back and I can't go forward. When I read Neil Postman in my love, I think he wants to go to like the 1800s but have antibiotics, right? He kind of wants to have his cake and eat it too. But we can't do that. So how do we be faithful now? Is always just a big question. So I think too, speaking of the computer changes, I'm curious if in 50 years or so let's just say maybe 100 years, if we'll finally find some positives and kind of like the always on connected, scattered, fragmented thing, and we'll start to say, gosh, just like they always talk about the reading brain being very different than the oral pre-reading brain. And so, even the ability to hunt got better because it connected more visual spatial things. People became better hunters and they able to read. So I wonder if now we're learning to read a different way. Eventually we'll start to see different things. It's just that it's changing so fast we don't get to see 100 years and see. I'm curious about that. I'm also worried about it too. So my PhD work will be on how people engage with scripture on screens versus print. Since I do the work of building Bible software for closed countries where that's the only thing they have access to, so they're like digital Bible natives, literally. And then we kind of have them as like a secondary extra device. But my 6-year-old son is in kindergarten and they're reading on iPads from day one. So I'm interested in that difference and how different it is for him versus for me and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots and lots of fun areas. What other speakers did you like?
Yeah, something about
Yeah,
what
sure.
you already said is, I wonder if, get some younger input here than my thoughts, but I wonder if we're saying, if you just have a Facebook way of thinking and a Twitter way of thinking, and you can only pay attention to 140 characters, is that, what do the millennials think of that? I would think, one, what's the problem with that? And the underlying question is that the wave of the future? I mean, are we worried about them developing their brains in such a way that they won't be able to read a book? But nobody's going to read books in 10 years well. Is our society changing in such a way that they're actually becoming better prepared for what's ahead because of that?
Yeah, I mean, the historians talk about this Gutenberg parenthesis, right, from 1500s to 1950 or something like that. That was an era where people read these large books, but most of us probably, we'd have trouble getting through Moby Dick, right? And it's a challenging book, and it's more modern than Shakespeare, but it's hard, or Brothers Karamazov or something like that. Those are challenging books even for us. So, I think those things are changing, and I think that we can all see a loss. The question will be kind of like, is there a gain there? I don't know yet exactly what that is. That's why I always kind of want to encourage people to think about what kind of brain do I want to develop, just like I constantly think about what kind of body do I want to have, and I eat, and I go, all that stuff. If I can think the same way with my mind, and hopefully my soul as well. But I do think that we were talking earlier with Matthew. In some ways, I like to think that there was no golden ages. Like sometimes people talk about the 1950s being so great. That was a horribly racist time. It was a terrible time, right? So we have different terriblenesses now than there were at different times. So I don't want to look back at golden eras because I don't think they exist. But I do think the character of what the kinds of decisions people have to face today are different. And I often use the analogy of like food. So all of human existence, people have been struggling to get just enough food to survive. Well, now we have an abundance of food. And so we have to choose like how many pieces will I eat? Will I get the cookie and all that kind of stuff? That was stuff nobody ever had to deal with in the history of humanity except for like a couple of kings. Right? So we all live like kings, even if we don't feel like it. So if that's true of food, right, we have to be disciplined in it in a way that nobody ever had to be. Now I think that's been true of information, right? So that we, just like we gravitate toward the easy food and not toward the challenging food, we're going to always gravitate toward the easy information to consume, not the challenging. So that's why we know more about Kim Kardashian than our neighbors, right? And in some very unfortunate ways. But we go toward those easy things, and then I think the relational stuff is there as well. So and of course we talk about the scourge of pornography and all those things that we go, gosh, that still is a lot more challenging issue because of something that used to be out there and now is in my pocket and all these screens here. And so I often think about my son. This is just not a family thing, and he sees dad like this, right? And I don't think he knows if I'm working or if I'm playing a game or if I'm reading the Bible or if I'm looking at pornography. He doesn't know because they're all on the same thing. And so I think one of our great challenges is that the crass way of putting it is that our work machines are our porn machines. And because those are the same thing, that ability to kind of have like a sacred space, like this space is for this thing. I feel this when I go there. Well, since we do everything on the same machine, now we have this challenge of saying, how can I separate it? Can I make it be sacred? And not even talk about like the obviously sinful parts, but just I struggled a lot in seminary because I'd be opening up my computer and I'd be working all day writing a bunch of code, and I would take that same computer into the classroom and I open up and the same code is there. So when the dumb guy asks the stupid question, then I'm going to go back to the code, right? So it's very, very hard for me to separate those things. I know that's just another one of those challenges. It's a kind of discipline that no one's ever had to have before. So as much as I want to say kids these days, I also have this real compassion because I feel like, wow, they have to have discipline that we've never had to have. Yeah. Rants. What else did you hear or not hear that you liked or appreciated?
Just that how visual everything is now, whereas before it did seem like there was more reading involved, and now everything it seems like, even from my perspective, it's what kind of I handle media relations, so what will they see? What can I pitch that is visual? That they would come and they will do a TV story, or they would do what kind of story? There are good stories to tell, but if there are no pictures to go with it, if there's nothing to show, it's people. We tend not to read things unless there's a picture that grabs our attention, and then we read it.
Yeah.
And so I find myself feeling like this next generation. I was actually kind of impressed back several years ago. I sat in on one of our engineering classes, and the students had done all these prototypes. They'd done designs, their prototypes, and they had to show the class for their presentation. And every last one of them put it on a video, because guess what? In the class, if your prototype doesn't work, you're sunk. And I learned this from they all put it on video because guess what? They couldn't make it. They could get it on video, put it up, and that was part of their prototype demonstration. Because then you didn't have to worry, the only thing you had to worry about is if the thumb drive didn't work. But then, you know, and that was when I realized video, even on this thing, is shooting, editing, telling, storytelling on video is like what typing was. We had to learn how to type. And I see that as the way of storytelling more and more in the future.
Okay, can I tell you it's going to seem like a total left turn to get back to your point? Are there any Bible props here? Okay, excuse me. Oh, that's right, of course, they're all there. Okay, so we're going to call these immatures. Okay, you know in the Gospels and in Acts when they say, believe, be baptized, and it says something like, believe and you will be saved, you and your household. What does that mean? Anybody interpret that passage? How does one person believe and the rest of the household get saved? Is that what we take
Your
to the
example?
temple? What's that?
Perhaps your example?
Perhaps your example? Yeah, I mean.
Your example will lead them.
And how many of us use that verse as our primary way of sharing the gospel? You're going to be saved, you and your household. Okay, so maybe what are some of the reasons why we do? Well, one theory is, here's what I'm getting at, is that in the advent of kind of the book, right, 1500s or 1400s with the Gutenberg press and all that stuff, that eventually by the 1800s when the printing press is getting really fast, you have this era of silent reading. So reading used to always be verbal. So whenever you read something, you would always say it out loud. So there's that part where Augustine, in his Confessions in the 400s, he sees a guy who reads silently, and he's just like, that is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Silent reading is just immense. So around 1800s, that's when something more about it. But especially with the advent of the book, that people start to read by themselves now. And so what you get is this kind of conception in the Western mind, concurrent with the book, of the individual, of the self. So you move from this a little bit more tribal, a little more communal understanding of humanity to a little bit more of the self, right? And so then you get, instead of this communal church, now you get Protestantism. We go about it and we do our own thing. And you also get Protestant ways of understanding salvation, so that I become saved and I have a personal relationship with Jesus. And I pray a prayer and I get saved. Not me and my family, but I get saved. So there's this highly individualistic thing that happens when you go off into a corner and you open up a book and you encode and decode things on your own, and then you close it. And you have this anonymous access to a dead man's thoughts. It's a very, very powerful, shaping thing. But it seems like that was a certain specific period of time. Whereas if you think about the average Israelite after Moses, how would they have taken in the gospel of that time? Would they have read their Bibles? Would they have had quiet times? At the temple, right? And what did the temple would communicate to them?
Pretty sure read the scriptures.
But anything else besides reading the scriptures?
Sacrifices.
Yeah, sacrifices. Like literally every single thing in the temple was designed to communicate something to another. So everything was, to your point, everything was visual in what they were communicating to. So certainly they could hear, and because they didn't have access to something, all the little studies would show that if your mind believes it's going to have access to something in the future, you just won't memorize it. So you have to just cram it in your head if you want to. But if you don't think you're going to have access to it, then your mind won't hold on to it. So I think people could memorize whole passages of scripture, and yet at the same time, everything around them is designed to tell them something about who God is. So I think there's maybe something to learn. Like we read through the Pentateuch and go, wow, so much of this stuff was so thoughtfully designed. And I think that's why you're seeing a return from big box churches. So I kind of grew up in the more free church evangelical. I mean, my parents went to whatever church they wanted to when we moved around. So we went to every denomination. But we went for a little while to kind of the big box Bible church type things, where it was more about efficiency and size. So it was kind of mirroring like some technological priorities. And you're starting to see like a shift back where there's a lot of millennials now that they love flip phones. Some are going like, we don't want these. It's kind of like the typewriter. It's a very kind of a hipstery type thing. But you're seeing these returns back to rejecting and thinking through things a little bit. So I think there's a strange, interesting intersection between a fully illiterate visual culture to a fully literate, not really a lot visual, to now this kind of interesting intermingled thing too. But I think it's hard for us as educators that grew up in one era to communicate to somebody who grew up in another.
communication face-to-face anymore. It's oral communication through video or whatever it happens to be. But basically, everything old is new again, just in a different way.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I mean, for a while the phone was this, just the audio thing, and I remember I think when my son was born, they didn't have FaceTime yet, so we had to talk on the phone. And I realized he had to be habituated to enjoying disembodied daddy. He hated disembodied daddy, right? He just hated the phone. It was a terrible thing. So I forced him when I would go on trips like this to enjoy disembodied daddy. But then now there's, with FaceTime and stuff like that, there's a little bit of a return. And it's never quite the same. I still think it's characters, it's different. But it is nice that that's been restored a little bit. There's a really, really great, though, it was written in like 1905, it's a little sci-fi book where this guy kind of envisions a world where everybody sits in their own pod and they just communicate via screens and stuff. And it's fantastic to see what someone in 1905 thought of this world. So yeah, I think there's some cycles, but I also think that the previous technology never really seems to go away. So some of the people like Neil Postman would put it this way, he'd say, technology is ecological. So you always think of it as like an ecosystem, like if you had like an aquarium, you had a bunch of fish in it, everything's fine, but if you drop like a shark with laser beams on it, it's gonna change the makeup of what's in it. Right? So when you drop in television to the world of radio and books, radio doesn't go away, books don't go away, but kind of the ecological makeup of the system changes. So like I don't think that print Bibles are going to go away and digital Bibles will take over. I think there's always going to be some ecological mix of those things. But I remember when I was a youth pastor, so this is like 15 years ago, and I really wanted to get a projector because half the kids had Bibles and the other half the kids didn't have the Bibles, so we always give out the Bible. But we'll show the projector, we'll show the Bible up there, and maybe play Xbox, and it'll be great. And but then, of course, what happened to their Bible reading? We got the projector. Now nobody brings the Bibles, right? And yet, there was this other, to your point of kind of going back in my mind. At first, I thought I was like the world's worst youth pastor because at a Bible church, you're supposed to bring your Bibles. But I realized like every kid who did bring their Bible had a custom Bible with their chosen translation and their name stamped on it and pictures of cats if that's what they were into. It was very much about them and their personal relationship with Jesus. But when you put it up on the screen, now all of a sudden we have a common vision and we're all sharing it as a community. And so, you realize people brought Bibles to church from like the 1930s or 40s, like basically our kind of era when the publishers figured out they could market to individuals and not just to families. So there was this little era where people brought their own Bibles to church, and that era is gone. Right? None of us bring Bibles to church that often. We use our phones or we use screens. Yeah, so that even the screen illustration from 15 years ago is out of date. But so there is some like cyclicalness to it, I think. Like we're all back to a common text, but yet it's different to see a common text on the screen than to hear it said and then take it home. That was the only way you had access to Scripture. And so even in like, again, the way that we do Scripture, so there's almost no command in Scripture that ever says, study the Bible. It's just not there. There's one time where it says Ezra did that and he was praised for it, but the commands are always hear, meditate, and obey. Hear, meditate, and obey. There's never a time to study. But when we got the book, a book way of using the Bible is to study. So we have Bible studies. Right? We don't have Bible meditation groups, do we? We don't do that because we wouldn't do that with print. That sounds weird in Eastern, doesn't it? But that's what the Bible asks us to do, is to hear and meditate. And then in order to meditate, we have to memorize. So in a way, the way we interact with the print Bible is very much like print's priorities. Even the technology, the most powerful technology in all of Christianity was invented in 1550s. Anybody know what it is? It was the chapter and verse system that a printer added. So I personally, when I wake up in the morning, I read a chapter of the Bible, and I know Jesus loves me. I read that chapter. But I got a Bible that didn't have chapters and verses recently, and it's so disconcerting. Because you just have no idea if Jesus loves you. Without that layer of technology to tell me whether or not I passed the test, I don't know. So I think that's another fun one with that going back. So it's like a hipster Bible, without chapters and verses. And it's so nice to just sit there and read it. So ESV has a great Reader's Bible, and NIV has a great one out there. technology-free Bibles. I want to ask you this. When you hear the word screen time, what do you think of? How do you manage? So I thought you were raising your hand in the back with an observation.
Your face on at a screen, whether it's an iPad or an iPhone or television, but screen time to me is just the time that you're looking at a screen.
So is screen time something that we should limit or set a from or?
Screen time was something, at least for us growing up, we had to earn. So it was like, go play outside for a half hour, you get 15 minutes of screen time kind of thing. So,
Okay, so my son, he's asked by his school to read for 20 minutes a day on a screen when he comes home. So how do I get him to earn his homework? I had another friend that was he was having trouble with his with sleep patterns, so he went and did the sleep study thing. And, the doctor said that when people have trouble waking up in the morning, the therapy for that is that you get these really bright white lights and you shine on them, you know, at 7 o'clock in the morning when you want them to wake up. And your skin feels that light, and then it sends adrenaline through your body when you wake up. So it's called the white box therapy. And she said, what you're doing is every night at 10 o'clock, you're giving yourself white box therapy when you look on the screen. And so what's happening is that your body is kicking up all this adrenaline. And so you have two sources of adrenaline. One is the white light from the screen, and the other one is, there's something different from like when a TV is far away and it's passive, you're just kind of watching it. It doesn't do the white box therapy and it's passive. But when it's white box right in your face and you have like an email or something that kind of like triggers a dopamine response, you know, that little, you know, the little red circle with a number in it, you know, when you get to get that down, like that feeling, you all know what that is. But that does some, those two things wake you up. And so she said, you need to turn your screen off 2 hours before you go to bed. Or maybe she said 3 hours. And she said, if you can't do that, you don't need to see me anymore. You need to go see a psychiatrist.
No.
But then I thought, okay, maybe I'll try this thing. But then it was like April 10th, and I had to do my taxes. It's 9 o'clock. And the only way to do taxes is in front of the screen. So I think what I'm needing to get at is this. I think the screen time, probably like what you grew up with, that kind of maybe made sense because most screen time is like a consumptive activity, a passive consumption. I think now there's so much that we do that's creative that way. So I'm thinking, you know, Minecraft to me is very different than Halo, for just as an example, or Call of Duty. So Minecraft, there's this creative activity. It's different than Legos, but it's also something, you know, where someone's visual spatially doing something. And even though it's kind of a game, I still think of that as characteristically different than a video game. And doing homework and those things are different than maybe social time. But I wouldn't have limited phone time in the same way. So I feel like it's confusing. That screen time maybe isn't the easiest. It wasn't the easy solution it used to be.
I sometimes feel that when you look at just screen time and limit it, it inherently makes that technology viewed as negative instead of looking at it as a tool, and how you use that tool is what you should evaluate.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I don't think that previous generations limited like paper time. But in one way that's fine. On the other hand, I mean, the American Pediatric Society would say if you let your kid under 2 watch television, you're going to damage them for the rest of their life. So it doesn't matter if it's Baby Einstein or if it's Dexter. It doesn't matter what the content of what they're watching. Watching screens before you're 2 will kind of hurt you, right? So they say no screen time before 2, any kind of screen time. So there are those things where it is different than a book, and yet I think your point is to say, gosh, I really want to think through more clearly what I'm doing, even though I recognize that whether I'm using it for good or for bad, it still shapes me. But to say to know that there's multiple modes of usage. And again, the challenge, I think, is that figuring out of, you know, all week I'm checking all kinds of things on here. So when I go to church and I pull out the Bible, it's always hard not to want to shift into one of those other modes. You know, it's not just that I'm an annoying texter. It's just that that's all I ever do. Right? So it's very hard to separate those activities. So you should all go buy 2 phones, one for your Bible. What are you guys doing on campus? Do you have students experimenting with various kind of wearable tracking type stuff, tracking calories and steps and breathing and glucose levels and all that kind of stuff. Are your students doing that in engineering?
I mean, some people wear those Fitbits, but I mean, that's not an assignment.
Yeah. You've seen a little bit on campus, not too much.
Yeah, some people are doing it.
Yeah. And were there a lot of glass users for a while on campus?
I've only seen a couple. You mean Google Glass?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking Glass.
Any of you gonna buy a watch? My watch? Apple Watch? Any interest? I do sometimes enjoy getting those things to try to like make something out of it. But Google Glass, I couldn't get into. So it just sits on my desk. I think that's where it sits for most people. But I think Google Glass though is a good example to me of going, okay, I know in your classes, I know some of the engineering professors were talking before about you're trying to think through impacts of whatever you're going to make. You're trying to think through what are those unintended consequences when you make something. It sounds like Laterno is doing an outstanding job of at least trying to get students to think through those things. It's hard for them to do when they're 19 or so. But I don't think you can always know what they're going to be. So with something like Google Glass, it's great to see that they were willing to experiment with something that I think has failed. Like, I think it didn't work. And now we've learned something from it. And if you've done it, you're reading in that kind of technology and faith period, usually people bring up Amish people at some point. And usually the example is not just that they don't use it, but it's a positive example of usually within an Amish community, there's a few early adopters who will try something, and they'll try it for 2 or 3 months, kind of under the guidance of their elders or whatever it's called, and then they kind of have to report back and evaluate, and they have this very deep evaluative system that they decide whether or not they're going to introduce something into their community or not. And I think so much of our tools today are built focused on the individual, so it's custom stuff. There's 7 different sizes of iPhones now. It's all about like your size and you. I think it's neat to see that they think about technology in such a deeply communal way. And I wonder if I'm hoping in my own family that there's ways that we can begin to have technological practices we do together as a family. So that hopefully when my kids go off to college, there maybe are things they would do in their dorm. So I know you have a very strong dorm hall system at Laterno. That's still true, right?
Right.
And I always wonder if there's things that a hall could do to have kind of ways that they learn about technology together. And doing dumb experiments like a couple months ago, or years ago actually, there's a gas station down the street from my house, and I thought, okay, what if I didn't read any internet news for a week, and I walked down to the gas station, bought a newspaper, and walked back with it and read that. And I found that at work, it's very hard to be discreet about checking the news. Right? That was one. I found that when you pay for news, you read different things. And then when you have sort of one access point, it changes what you read. It was a great experiment. It was really fun to do for a week, and I will never do it again, but it was a great experiment. So I would love to see if Wings could do experiments to it.
Did you find that when you were at work with the newspaper open, people would walk by, and it's like, oh, you're loafing.
Yeah.
But you're the communication person.
Yeah.
So if people see you with a newspaper, sit at your desk with a newspaper, it's like, oh, look, you're loafing.
No, I mean,
you're just
quite
sitting reading the
happen.
paper, but it's part of what you're supposed to do, is no.
Yeah. No, I wish I had a great anecdote like that to tell you that the president of the school walked by and was like, what's going on here? But no, you do feel conspicuous. It feels different than when it's on the screen. And so that was just an interesting feeling difference about those things. So not just, turning something off for a while, but turning something else on and seeing what it is.
One other thing that I think I have found is that the technology of putting Bluetooth headphones on and listening to the news, I listen to audible.com all the time. I'm always listening to a book. If I'm in the car, I listen to a book.
Yeah.
And it seems like I'm able to read and learn about so much more than, granted, I don't remember it all, always, but it's less, sitting at the table, flipping through the newspaper, looking like I'm not doing it.
Yeah, it is interesting. I had a 30-minute commute, so I listened to a lot of Audible, and I feel like I'm kind of redeeming the time a little bit. At the same time, I'm like, am I just treating myself like a machine, by trying to maximize outputs and inputs, and that subject has made me think a lot about, I want to say that we create as God creates when we image him, but it seems like we can't really claim to work in the way that God works without also resting the way that God rests. And so I know in my profession, you know, I like to claim it's because of my profession, because I'm a web developer, that I have to have an always-on connection. You know? So I wonder, I mean, do in any of your discussions with students, I mean, without being sort of puritanical or Old Testament, how do you help them work with some concept of Sabbath or rest or breaks or fasting or something like that?
I work in student life.
Okay.
And that is actually the topic that I really want us as a campus to tackle next year, because I would think college students everywhere are busy, and I think busyness is endemic of our entire culture. But I think specifically here at this school with what's required of these students, and not that I'm saying we shouldn't require difficult things of them, but like what you said before about they have to have disciplines that other people haven't had to have, you know. And so I'm not saying, okay, let's give them less class, you know, but at the same time, what disciplines? And I think that is one of the biggest problems that our students face on this campus. And so that question that you're asking, I think that is the $1 million question for our community. And so I'm very fascinated in what.
Yeah, when you have an academically rigorous place, you have engineering and computers as a deep part of that, and then sometimes you have that kind of like Christian overwork ethic, you know, that can mix things up, right? And so that doing things for Jesus becomes more valuable than resting as God rested. So a little bit out of balance. I can say those all really contributing to something.
And we have very high achieving people who are
Yeah.
used to success and
Yeah.
not just passing, but getting an A,
Yeah.
and winning approval of authority figures. And I'm not trying to say that they should not do well, but yes, there's a lot that just goes into our culture. It's
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, no, I mean, it would be I know that you see that a lot in the tech sector right now where, you know, you guys saw Facebook and Google's announcement about the freezing the eggs for women. And on one hand, that's, you know, trying to get more women into technology. On the other hand, it has that subtle expectation that, like, your 20s are about work, right? Your 30s are about work. And then maybe after that, you can use your programs, right? So it's really, really hard to figure out how would we upset those things. And I know it's not just as simple as like close down Chick-fil-A on Sundays. You know, that's good. But even sometimes I've heard Kathy say like the reason why you close down on Sunday is because it makes the chicken better on the other 6 days. That seems to be an instrumentalist view of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for the work and not for itself, right? And I think, gosh, you know, what if we worked for the Sabbath? The whole point of work was for that. So I know I'm struggling with that in my own life. And again, I think it's because, you know, the always-on world is hard. And we can control everything. You know, we can control the weather and the seasons. We can control the cycles of a woman's body. We can control the day and nighttime. But at some point, you know, we have to say, I'm out of control and the world doesn't depend on me. I can stop.
I would argue that our students don't rest well because they don't know the difference between relaxing and resting, or zoning out and resting. They put the picture of resting is turning away from my books or my schoolwork and like turning on Netflix for 2 hours instead of resting being something else. And maybe that is restful, but there's not just as much, there's not a theology of rest coming from us. There's also not a theology of relax.
Yeah, and I think that the concept of like play is really challenging too, because I know sometimes when I've been in technology discussions with people that are a little more critical, they're like, gosh, people make things without even thinking about it. And I'm like, yes, that's wonderful. Right? My kid makes things out of Legos that don't have any point. He just likes making. So creativity for creativity's sake is wonderful, beautiful, and good. And the challenge for me is my job is to write code, but I kind of like doing that as a hobby too. And so figuring out when is it restful and when is it work is really challenging. And then if play is like video games, it's really, really hard to figure out where do I need to draw lines, because just that screen time, not screen time isn't it. internet on or internet off isn't just it. So it's pretty hard, I think, to shape and create something that it requires more discipline than I think before.
So on the topic of work and play and mixing them and technology, screen time, when students are in class and they're getting that screen time, oh, I'm taking notes.
Yeah.
But if you sit behind them and you see that they're, playing games, they're on Facebook or whatever, and that's been such a rising problem in classrooms. I recently read an op-ed, and I think it was in the Chronicle, where the guy said, no technology in the classroom.
Yeah.
Someone wrote a response back, said, yes, technology in the classroom. Where have you seen a balance being struck? How do you integrate that?
I think it does depend. I've seen a professor one time teaching about the Holocaust turn off all the lights in the room and turn off everything, even the heaters, so that people came in and felt something. But that's about the only time I've ever seen somebody educationally use a lack of technology of light. So I think you're always going to have some element of technology in the classroom. So again, we have to kind of go down like
Whiteboards with technology.
yeah, which ones? What are we talking about? And I think even like 5 years ago, I think people would have been really resistant to the no screens in the classroom thing. I think now there's an understanding that there's a time and place a little bit, and I think even like I was giving examples of kind of the retro and flip phone usage and stuff like that. I think people under 25 are much more reflective now. Now, if you just try to take it away immediately, they kind of freak out. But I think if you set those expectations there, I know many professors that are extremely sort of high-tech people, writers that do no computers in the classroom kind of things. I've also seen those apps that do things like report usage or let you kind of lock down to one application for an hour. And one professor was saying that they were thinking about trying to use that and just saying, okay, let's all turn this thing on so we can just take notes, but it won't let you do anything else. And other people using iPads because they're not terribly good at multitasking. They only let one thing be on the screen at a time. That's helped some students. But I think setting that expectation from the beginning is a good thing. Now we can't do engineering without computers ever, but deciding when and where we need to work. So I think, are we toward the end of our time, Matthew? I want to be sensitive to everybody's.
1 o'clock, sure.
Good, okay. Well, anybody else want to mention any other things interesting from the semester?
Well, leave your cell phones on the table here when you leave. Well, thank you, John, very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It really is a pleasure to be back. This is great. So thank you for